You can have money in the bank and great health insurance, and you can have access to the best doctors and the best hospitals in the world and still not survive a major health crisis. Because when that moment comes, most people realize something too late. The care that you receive matters, but what often matters even more is how much reserve your body had before the crisis began. When I took care of patients in the hospital, I saw the same pattern over and over again. You had two people come in the hospital with the same diagnosis, and they're same age, same severity, same treatment plan, and one of them recovers in days and goes home, but the other one spirals and develops complications, and they end up in the ICU. And the difference was often not what we did in the hospital, it was what their body had available before they ever got sick. And that is especially relevant today because our healthcare system is completely broken. At least in the US. Wait times are longer, your follow-up care often falls through the cracks, and even if you survive and recover, your insurance company may still deny your coverage. So now you're fighting your health insurance company at the exact moment you have the least strength to do it. So the uncomfortable truth is you cannot fully rely on the healthcare system when things go wrong, which means the more reserve you build before a crisis, the better your odds when it happens. And that reserve is what I call your health emergency fund. Same idea as your financial emergency fund, but instead of money in the bank, it's the capacity built into your body. So in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to build your health emergency fund. Because that reserve you build into your body may be the difference between recovering function after a stroke or tolerating chemotherapy long enough for it to work, or whether a broken hip becomes the start of a long decline or something you quickly bounce back from. Because for all of us, a health emergency is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Now, the first thing I'd put into your health emergency fund is vitamin D, because it's one of the simpler ones to fix and one of the most commonly missed. Vitamin D is not just about bones, it's actually one of the clearest examples of what I mean by a health emergency fund. Because when your vitamin D is low, your body has less reserve to handle serious stress. So your vitamin D status can affect how well you recover from a bad infection, or how well you heal after surgery, and even your risk of dying from cancer. And the payoff here is huge. So there was a large hospital study. Patients with vitamin D deficiency had more than double the risk of dying in the hospital. And they also stayed in the hospital longer by about 1.3 extra days on average. That's a big difference. And this is where many people get vitamin D wrong. The goal is not to wait until somebody's already in the ICU or in the hospital and then try to rescue them with one giant dose. We actually have studies on this, like the Violet trial, and in that trial they showed that given high doses of vitamin D during a critical illness actually did not show any benefit. So the value of vitamin D does not seem to come from trying to fix it in the middle of a crisis. It really comes from having enough on board before the crisis even starts. And that same pattern also shows up with cancer. There was a meta-analysis of 14 randomized control trials, and they had more than 100,000 participants. And they found that daily vitamin D lowered cancer mortality by 12%. And that's the key point. You need steady levels. This is why I don't think about vitamin D as just a dose. I think about it as a target, because the dose means very little if you don't know what the blood level you actually reached. And while there's still debate about the ideal level of vitamin D in your blood, the way I approach this with my patients, because we look at it through the lens of longevity and increasing health span, we usually try to aim for a level between 40 to 60. Now, this is based on studies like this pooled analysis of 2,300 women, where they saw that vitamin D levels of 40 and higher were associated with a 67% lower risk of invasive cancer compared to those with levels below 20. Now, this is not a blanket recommendation for everyone. A person's target level may depend on their individual profile and their medical history and what they're trying to accomplish. So definitely talk to your doctor about what your individual target level and what your dose should be, because it's different for everyone. And then we see the same pattern unfold with surgeries. A recent meta-analysis found that having low vitamin D below 20 before surgery was linked to a 42% higher risk of post-operative infections. Now, one important point here is a lot of this data is observational, which means it shows a link, but it does not prove cause and effect. So the question is low vitamin D part of the problem, or is it just a marker of poor health? And I think it's actually a little bit of both. because meta-analyses of randomized control trials, so these are the studies where we can better infer causation, do show a benefit with both cancer mortality and ICU mortality. But vitamin D is just the beginning, because there's another part of your body that most people completely overlook, and that part may determine whether your cancer treatment works or it doesn't. And that part is in your gut. Your gut microbiome, which is that community of trillions of bacteria living in your digestive tract, plays a much bigger role in your overall health than most people realize. About 70% of your immune cells are located in and around your gut. So the mix and the diversity of those bacteria directly influence how well your immune system functions. So how well it fights infections, and even how well it responds to medical treatments, especially these newer immunotherapy treatments for cancer. So there was a study published in Science back in 2018 where researchers looked at patients with melanoma being treated with an immunotherapy drug. And they found that the patients with a more diverse gut microbiome responded much better to the treatment. So same drugs, same cancer, but different gut bacteria, which led to different outcomes. And it's not just melanoma. In people who had stem cell transplants, studies found that the 3-year survival rate was much higher in those with high microbiome diversity, 67% compared to 36% in those with low diversity. So think about what that means. If someone develops cancer 10 or 20 years from now and needs immunotherapy, the diversity of their gut microbiome could be the determining factor whether that treatment works well enough to put their cancer into remission. And gut microbiome diversity is something you have to build over time through what you eat. You want to aim for high fiber foods, so both soluble and insoluble fiber, and then also get enough fermented foods and a wide variety of plant foods. These are the things you're putting into your health emergency fund today for a crisis you just cannot predict tomorrow. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is your muscle mass, because that matters for a lot more than just strength. So most people think of muscle as something for the gym, something cosmetic, but muscle is one of the most metabolically active tissues in your entire body. And when that health emergency hits, your muscle mass may matter more than anything else in your arsenal. So muscle does a few things that we often underappreciate. First, it helps regulate blood sugar. Your muscle tissue is incredibly efficient at absorbing glucose, even without insulin. So the more muscle mass you carry, the better your blood sugar control tends to be, almost independently of anything else that you're doing. And that alone has ripple effects on your heart and your brain and your metabolism, and even your cancer risk. And second, muscle produces molecules called myokines, which are basically these chemical messengers that get released when muscle contracts. And some of those myokines have direct anti-inflammatory effects. So if you're carrying more muscle and you're using it regularly, your baseline level of chronic inflammation comes down. And chronic inflammation is one of the biggest drivers of aging and chronic disease. So bringing that down is very important. But here's where this gets very real. There's a condition called sarcopenia, which is basically the progressive loss of muscle and strength. And when you look at what happens to people with low muscle mass during a health crisis, the numbers are pretty striking. So there was a study looking at patients admitted to the ICU, and it found that those with low muscle mass at the time of admission had more than double their mortality risk. So just having low muscle mass more than doubled your chances of dying. And on the flip side, patients with higher muscle mass at the time of hospital admission had better survival and faster recovery across the board. And with cancer, the data is just as clear. There's a recent meta-analysis of 39 studies where they looked at nearly 9,000 cancer patients. And they found that having low muscle mass was associated with a 44% higher risk of treatment-related side effects and a 66% higher risk of death in patients receiving chemotherapy and radiation. So patients with low muscle mass were not only more likely to die, they were also more likely to have their treatment interrupted or reduced because their body just couldn't handle it. And those interruptions directly affect whether the treatment works or it doesn't. And muscle mass isn't just protecting you during illness, it's also protecting your bones, because the same resistance training that builds muscle is also one of the most effective ways to maintain your bone density. And that matters because in older adults, a hip fracture from a single fall can unfortunately be the start of a rapid decline. You lose mobility, which leads to more muscle loss, which leads to metabolic decline, and suddenly you're deep inside the healthcare system for months because of something that started with one fall. So muscle and bone, they work together. And building one builds the other. Muscle is probably one of the most important foundational pieces for your physiological reserve. That total capacity your body has to take a major hit and come back on the other side. The more you have when you walk into the hospital, the faster you get out. Now, I mentioned earlier that muscle absorbs glucose even without insulin, and that connects directly to something that ties almost everything we talked about together, which is insulin sensitivity, or how well your cells respond to insulin when it tells them to pull sugar out of your blood. Because when insulin resistance develops, your pancreas has to work overtime and it has to pump out more and more insulin to try to force all that excess glucose into cells that are no longer responding. And that excess insulin drives so many bad things that plague us today, like inflammation and visceral fat and high blood pressure and diabetes and heart disease. It just creates problems across every organ system. Now, here's how it connects to your health emergency fund. During a health crisis, whether that's an infection or surgery or chemotherapy, your metabolism is under enormous stress. And if you're already insulin resistant going in, you're starting to fight in a weakened state. In fact, even an acute infection can reduce insulin sensitivity by more than 50%, and that effect can last for months after recovery. So we do not want to walk into a crisis already insulin resistant, because the crisis itself is going to make things even worse. And that can mean more inflammation and worse blood sugar control, which then leads to poor wound healing after surgery and even worse recovery after something like a stroke. This is where the health emergency fund starts to work as a system, because the muscle mass you're building helps absorb glucose. And the gut microbiome regulates inflammation and it supports a healthy immune system. So each piece strengthens the others. So just like having money set aside for emergencies, you gotta build a physiological reserve for health emergencies as well. Because in our broken healthcare system, where medical debt is the #1 cause of bankruptcy in this country, your health and your finances are not separate things. A stronger body means faster recovery, which then means less medical bills and less interactions with the system. I hope this was helpful. Stay healthy, and I'll see you in the next one.